Hi everyone, welcome back to Winging It. We're in week 51 of our quilt project, and although it's been quite a while since the last episode, this is the next stage in the process. So I'm going to show you today how to square off and how to bind your quilt. Now there are loads of ways of doing this, and I have said right from the start that I'm not an experienced quilter, so this is the way that I'm going to do it. There are loads of different ways. Do feel free to search across YouTube because there are loads of tips for you. I just wanted to show you that I have finished hand quilting now. So I've stitched around all of the motifs on the quilt and around the edges of each block. And I love that it's gained this lovely puckered feel, love the effect that quilting has. And I've also stitched along each piece on our border as well. So each of those strips is stitched along, and it's taken me about 4 months on and off to do this. Some of the blocks, they're plain blocks. If I zoom right in, you can see I've put in some diagonal lines to create diamond shapes. There's another block where I've done circles. I've stitched along all of the bug trails that we sewed in, and this one as well, the snail, because it was trapunto, there's quite a lot of puckering around it, and hopefully you can see that as I've quilted around the outside of the snail, that's balanced that right out. So quilting doesn't just hold together your quilt layers, it also will even out some of the issues that you might have come across as you've been making your quilt. Do excuse the unsteady camera, I'm holding this in my hand. So that is our completed quilt sandwich, all hand quilted, and I've also as well some of these little embellishments that we put on, I've stitched around all of those as well. So everything on this quilt is stitched together now, and so we're ready to finish off our quilt, bind it and put it in the washing machine. Now in that process it did sort of pull the quilt top away from the quilt back. I did make the quilt back slightly smaller, but hopefully you can just see through the batting there that the quilt top is a little bit bigger than the backing, and that's not actually a problem because our binding will cover that. So binding will cover a multitude of sins. This is far from the perfect quilt sandwich, but we're going to cover over all of that through the process. The first thing we're going to do is square off our edge, and in order to do that I'm going to first of all tack right around the outside edge of the quilt, and that's because particularly on these corner pieces there isn't any quilting there, and so we don't want the layers of the quilt to be flapping open while we're trying to square it off. So I've got just a contrasting thread. This one's bright red, I don't know whether you can see it or not on screen, and I'm just doing a running stitch, fairly loose, just a tacking stitch about 1 centimetre in from the edge of the quilt. You won't need to take these stitches out because they'll be covered by the binding, so don't worry too much about it. You just want to be about 1 centimetre in from the quilt edge, and you don't need to worry about catching all 3 layers. Obviously our quilt back is more than 1 centimetre smaller than the quilt front, so this is all about protecting that batting. So as you're manipulating it, you don't want it to pull or stretch or move. So I'm just been all the way around the top, just coming down the bottom edge, and just typically I run out of thread about 10 inches away from the end. So that's that job done now. So what we're going to do now is square off the quilt. You hopefully saw I've got my cutting mat underneath, and what I want to do is match up the corners, and we're going to work on the verticals. So we're going to square off the top and bottom edges of the quilt first of all. So we want to find the corners of the quilt top. We know that because we did loads of really careful measuring, the main grid of the quilt topper is pretty much square, and so we're going to use that quilt top to guide us. And if you want to, you can slice off the corners of that excess batting just so that you can find the corners of your quilt top and match them up a little bit better. I do just go off the edge of the screen here a little bit because I couldn't see what the camera was looking at. Please forgive me. But I'm just going to get these are the two top corners. Actually, you can see the quilt's upside down there. And I'm going to match those up so that they are in line with each other, and that's just going to find my centre line. It's that centre line that we're looking for here. So I'm folding my quilt in half and I'm just smoothing out as I go so that the two edges of the quilt, the left and right edge, are lined up together, and the top left and right corners are matching and the bottom left and right corners are matching. And once I've matched that up, you can pin it if you want to. I'm just going to smooth it out to find that centre line as precisely as I can. I also am just going around the edge of the batting and making sure I don't have any folds or loops, so everything is just spread out in a single layer. So just smoothing along there, marrying up the edges of the quilt as best as I can, and making sure we are getting that fold in the quilt all the way down the centre. Now the reason I'm doing this is because I don't have a massive quilting table, and most of us don't. So I've got to make sure I can cut right across the top and bottom of my quilt in one go, and so I'm using half of the quilt because it fits neatly onto my cutting mat. So if you can do this all in a oneer and lay your quilt out completely straight, then you can do it that way, but I need to fold it. So now I'm working on that fold line down the centre of the quilt. I'm just going to line it up with a marking on my cutting mat. Now if you don't have a cutting mat, you can do this with a pair of scissors. You just need to do more measuring, and you need to measure from that fold line at the centre. So I've lined up the fold line with a line on my cutting mat, and now I'm going to bring in my ruler and my rotary cutter, and we're going to cut all that excess off the top of the quilt. So I'm going to find some markings on my cutting mat that allow me to cut straight across the top in a straight line without taking too much of my border off. Now if there's a little bit of a wobble and there's some batting showing once you've cut, it really doesn't matter because it's going to be covered by the binding. But I'm just finding a matching line, double checking that my quilt hasn't moved and my fold line is vertical. And as long as you match up each side of your ruler, you will get a square top. So this top is going to be square with that centre line. So I've just gone along with my rotary cutter there, taking away the excess. And when I move my ruler, you'll see we've got a really neat edge along the top of the quilt there. It doesn't matter that there's a bit of batting showing, that's all going to be covered by the binding. So now I'm going to flip the quilt and do exactly the same on the bottom edge. So again, I'm lining up that fold line with a line that's running vertically down my cutting mat, just to make sure I've got everything straight, smoothing it all out. There's a little bit of stretching on my batting there. This time I'm going to line up and cut along the bottom edge, so you'll see me running my rotary cutter along, taking away the excess, and that's our top and bottom edge totally square with the centre line. So now I'm going to repeat that in the opposite direction. So now I'm going to fold across the middle of the quilt. So I'm lining up the top left corner with the bottom left corner and the top right corner with the bottom right corner, and we want to not be distracted by the border. We want to line up here the quilt edge so that cut edge that we've just made, because we know that that's square. So I'm just going to keep smoothing out and just nudging and realigning, and it is really worth taking a bit of time over this to make sure that it's precise. So once you're happy with the two edges and with your fold line being vertical down the mat, we just repeat that process. And so I'm just lining up my ruler with lines on my cutting mat as close to the edge of the quilt top as I can, and running along. You can see the stretching there causes ripples, so I'm just stopping every now and again and smoothing out that batting. And we take that away, flip the quilt, and just repeat the process. And do make sure that the cutting of that left hand side hasn't moved the two layers of quilt that you've got. So it's worth just double checking that your cut edges are lined up and that your quilt is straight. And then we pop the ruler on again and cut our final edge, and that gives me a completely squared off quilt. Now your borders might not be exactly the same size, it really doesn't matter, the binding is going to cover over all of that. So you can see we've got a nice sharp corner there, squared off edges, and we're working in straight lines. So now I've got my border strips, and I've cut strips that are 10 centimetres wide and the length of the width of fabric. So I got some quilting fabric, folded it in half and cut 10 centimetre strips. So it's however wide your fabric is, gives you the length. And you want to cut enough that you can join two together to cover up the length of one side. So I've cut off all the selve edges and I'm lining these up right sides together and just popping a couple of pins in. So your strips might be longer than mine, they might be shorter than mine, it depends on what fabric you're using, but they need to be 10 centimetres wide. And our quilt is roughly 1.5 metres square, so you just need to make sure that you've got at least 1.5 metres of fabric when you've got two strips together. I'm just marking in a 1 centimetre seam allowance on the join of that pair of strips that I've pinned right sides together, just popping in a line to help me. And then I'm going to get my sewing machine out and just sew along that join to join my two strips together, and that gives me plenty to work with. Now you can, if you want to, make sure the join in your binding is central to your quilt. I'm not going to worry about it because I think it's going to draw more attention to it if I do that. Just going to open up my two pieces and finger press that seam open. So I'm back on my dining table and I'm going to mark in a line for that binding piece to sit along. So I want to mark 1.5 centimetres and 2.5 centimetres from the quilt edge. So we're talking about the cut edge, not the edge of the top of fabric. So I'm just going to put those two marker points in all the way down the side of the quilt. I'm just working on the right hand side of the quilt here because it's upside down. So just going in all the way along that quilt edge, marking 1.5 centimetres and 2.5 centimetres. And now I'm going to bring my binding strip back in. I'm going to put it right sides together. So you're looking at the wrong side of the fabric. And I want to line it up with that 1.5 centimetre line. So the markers that are closest to the quilt edge. So that's going to give me a little bit of the quilt showing to the left of the border, and I'm just going to go along and pin it perpendicular to the seam that I'm going to sew. Now obviously we've covered up our 2.5 centimetre line, that's going to come in useful shortly. So I'm pinning all the way along. Don't pull on your binding, just smooth it with your hand there, so just smooth it out. If you pull it, you'll get puckering that you don't want. and then I'm going to sew along that with a 1 centimetre seam allowance. So even though I can't see it on the quilt, I am sewing along that 2.5 centimetre line that we marked in. I'm just carefully going along, lifting the weight of the quilt onto my table as I go, and I'm just stitching along with a 1 centimetre seam allowance in from the edge of the binding. It's really important that you don't do 1 centimetre from the edge of the quilt, because you won't catch the binding. So now I'm back at my dining table, and I'm going to fold my binding back, and this is where our 2.5 centimetre line comes in really handy, because that's going to tell me that my binding is straight. So I'm going to fold back until I can see that 2.5 centimetre line and finger press the binding back on itself. Then I've flipped my quilt over, spread out my binding strip, and I'm marking in 1 centimetre. Now you can use your cutting mat for this if you don't want to mark it in. And I'm just going to fold back and finger press 1 centimetre seam allowance on the binding strip. So I'm just going along with my thumbs, folding back 1 centimetre of the fabric and finger pressing it open. You can use a seam roller if you want to. That might make your crease a bit firmer, but this was a warm day and my hands were nice and warm, so the fold was holding in place. So when you've done that, we're going to fold the binding back over the edge of the quilt, and you want to make sure here that you're not folding the binding. So if you've got any binding on show, you don't want that to fold. So you want to just make sure you're creasing your fabric at the quilt edge, folding it back, and then popping in a pin to hold that in place. So again, I'm just feeling along with my fingers just to make sure there are no lumps and bumps and I'm not folding the binding, and I'm smoothing that binding strip down onto the back of the quilt and pinning it in place. And I want to do that all the way along the left hand side of the quilt, and then I'm going to repeat the process on the right hand side of the quilt. So we're doing our 2 sides first of all. So again, take your time with this, keep feeling along with your fingers, making sure there's no lumps, no folds or puckers or creases, and smoothing out your backing fabric as you go along. We're going to hand stitch this in place. So that's me all pinned now, and so that's what the binding is going to look like. It's going to be narrower on the front than on the back, but we're going to have a nice straight edge. So I've come back to my sewing table and I'm just going to put some wonder clips in, and that's going to help hold the edge of the batting that's inside that binding straight so that we don't fold it or loop it over. So those wonder clips are just a fail safe. Got some thread that matches the colour of my binding, and I've tied a knot in the end, and I'm going to come in from the edge of the quilt through the fold in the binding. I'm working on the back here, and I'm going to do a little invisible hemming stitch along the edge. So I'm just tucking my needle through the top layer of the quilt. The top for me, it's the quilt back, but I'm not sewing all the way through the layers of the quilt. I'm just catching that fabric for the backing and a couple of threads of the binding fabric just on the fold. And as I work my way along, I'm going to take out those pins so that they don't get in my way. But I'm just catching just the tiniest little bit of fabric. It's like an applique stitch, I suppose. So we're just catching the tiniest little bit of fabric on the backing and the binding, just at the crease line on the hem, just to hold that in place. I'm going to work my way all the way along both sides. Now the process for the top edge and the bottom edge is pretty much the same, but this time, before I add my binding, I'm just going to fold back. I'm sorry, that's right at the top of the screen. I'm just going to fold back a 1 centimetre seam allowance at the edge of my quilt. And just like before, you get a better view of it. I'm marking 1.5 centimetres and 2.5 centimetres from the quilt edge. So you saw there where that batting is showing at the top of the quilt, I'm measuring from the edge of the batting, not the edge of the fabric. So that gives me a line to work with, and I'm going to lay my binding strip right side to right side along the 1.5 centimetre line. And when you're doing your top and bottom pieces, you want to make sure that the edge of that strip of binding is lined up with the very edge of the binding on the side of your quilt. So we're going to make a neat bound edge here at the corners. Now, like I said, there's lots of ways of binding. You can do this in one continuous piece, but this is a really beginner friendly way of adding the bindings. That's why I'm doing it. So I'm lining up that binding edge with the 1.5 centimetre markers I've put in and pinning all the way along that. And then we're going to fold that back when we've stitched. So we'll stitch a 1 centimetre seam on that binding, fold it back, and fold it over at the top edge, and that's going to give us a neat corner. Now we do have an opening here, and if we don't sew that down, this is going to be really loose and will open up. And so we're just going to whip stitch along that open edge once we've sewn our border pieces in place. So this is the last job you'll need to do when you put your quilt together. We're going to stitch through the edge, and again, just like before, we're catching just a couple of threads of the binding fabric on the extreme right hand side and the extreme left hand side. So we don't want to sew through all the folds. We're just going to seal that edge by whip stitching over the top. So tiny little stitches in a matching thread, and you'll hardly see it's there. I'm going to just stitch the length of that. And so that's how we add our binding and how we square off our quilt. That's how I've done it. And I'm just going to use this as a lovely mindful activity for an afternoon, just hand stitching those binding pieces down on the back of the quilt. So I hope you found that helpful, and I hope that's given you some tips and tricks for getting the best finish on your binding, even if you've never done it before. This is all about measuring and checking twice before you sew. Really, that's how you're going to get the best finish. So I'm going to work on that, and I will be back in a final video in this series to show you the finished quilt. I will link the playlist over on the left there, and I'll put another video to inspire you down at the bottom, and I will see you next time with a review of our year making our garden quilt. Bye!